August 8th, 1758. The French and Indian War is in full swing in upstate New York, near the border with Quebec. Major Israel Putnam, a 40-year-old officer from a distinguished family from Salem, Massachusetts, leads a force of Colonial soldiers against Mohawk and Kanawaki Indians in a battle near Crown Point, New York. Major Putnam co-led this company with Robert Rogers, and they would later achieve fame as Rogers Rangers. Although Rogers would eventually have the company named after him, Major Putnam was known at the time as the more daring and courageous officer, and on this day his boldness would cause him to fall into the hands of the enemy, and he would be subjected to the barbarous way in which they treated prisoners. In this episode we will hear Major Putnam's story from this book, Incidents of Border Life by Joseph Pritts. This book was published all the way back in 1838. Although these events occurred well before the Revolutionary War and the Northwest Indian War of the early 1790s, and they involved different tribes of Indians, these Indians appeared to treat prisoners in a very similar manner to how they treated Colonel William Crawford when he was captured. So here's the story of the capture of Major Putnam during the French and Indian War. Extract from Colonel Humphrey's Life of General Putnam. The events noticed occurred in August 1758. In the month of August, 500 men were employed under the orders of Majors Rogers and Putnam to watch the motions of the enemy near Ticonderoga. At South Bay, they separated the party into two equal divisions, and Rogers took a position on Wood Creek, 12 miles distant from Putnam. Upon being some time afterwards discovered, they formed a reunion and concerted measures for returning to Fort Edward. Their march through the woods was in 3 divisions by files, the right commanded by Rogers, the left by Putnam, and the center by Captain Dell. The first night they encamped on the banks of Clear River, about a mile from Old Fort Anne, which had been formerly built by General Nicholson. Next morning Major Rogers and a British officer named Irwin incautiously suffered themselves, from a spirit of false emulation, to be engaged in firing at a mark. Nothing could have been more repugnant to the military principles of Putnam than such conduct, or reprobated by him in more pointed terms. As soon as the heavy dew which had fallen the preceding night would permit, the detachment moved in one body, Putnam being in front, Dell in the center, and Rogers in the rear. The thick growth of shrubs and underbrush that had sprung up, where the land had been partially cleared some years before, occasioned this change in the order of march. At the moment of moving, the famous French partisan Molang, who had been sent with 500 men to intercept our party, was not more than 1.5 miles distant from them. Having heard the firing, he hastened to lay an ambuscade precisely in the part of the wood most favorable to his project. Major Putnam was just emerging from the thickets into the common forest, when the enemy rose, and with yells and whoops commenced an attack upon the right of his division. Surprised but undismayed, Putnam halted, returned the fire, and passed word for the other division to advance to his support. Dell came. The action, though widely scattered and principally fought between man and man, soon grew general and intensely warm. It would be as difficult as useless to describe this irregular and ferocious mode of fighting. Rogers came not up, but, as he declared afterwards, formed a circular file between our party and Wood Creek, to prevent their being taken in rear, or enfiladed. Successful as he commonly was, his conduct did not always pass without unfavorable imputation. Notwithstanding, it was a current saying in the camp that Rogers always sent, but Putnam always led his men to action. Yet, in justice, it ought to be remarked here that Putnam was never known, in relating the story of this day's disaster, to affix any stigma upon the conduct of Rogers. Major Putnam, perceiving it would be impracticable to cross the creek, determined to maintain his ground. Inspired by his example, the officers and men behaved with great bravery. Sometimes they fought aggregately to open view, and sometimes individually under cover, taking aim from behind the bodies of trees, and acting in a manner independent of each other. For himself, having discharged his fusee several times, at length it misfired, while the muzzle was pressed against the breast of a large and well-proportioned Indian. This warrior, availing himself of the indefensible attitude of his adversary, with a tremendous war-whoop sprang forward, with his lifted hatchet, and compelled him to surrender, and having disarmed and bound him fast to a tree, returned to the battle. The intrepid captains Dell and Harmon, who now commanded, were forced to give ground for a little distance. The Indians, conceiving this to be the certain harbinger of victory, rushed impetuously on, with dreadful and redoubled cries. But our two partisans, collecting a handful of brave men, gave the pursuers so warm a reception as to oblige them, in turn, to retreat a little beyond the spot at which the action had commenced. Here they made a stand. This change of ground occasioned the tree to which Putnam was tied to be directly between the fire of the two parties. Human imagination can scarcely figure to itself a more deplorable situation. The balls flew incessantly from either side. Many struck the tree, while some passed through the sleeves and skirts of his coat. In this state of jeopardy, unable to move his body, to stir his limbs, or even incline his head, he remained for more than an hour. So equally balanced and obstinate was the fight. At one moment, while the battle swerved in favor of the enemy, a young Indian chose an odd way of discovering his humor. He found Putnam bound. He might have dispatched him at a blow, but he loved better to excite the terrors of the prisoner by hurling a tomahawk at his head, or rather it should seem his object was to see how near he could throw it without touching him. The weapon struck in the tree a number of times, at a hair's breadth distance from the mark. When the Indian had finished his amusement, a French bass officer, a much more inveterate savage by nature, though descended from so humane and polished a nation, perceiving Putnam, came up to him, and leveling a fusee within a foot of his breast, attempted to discharge it, but it missed fire. Ineffectually did the intended victim solicit the treatment due to his situation by repeating that he was a prisoner of war. The degenerate Frenchman did not understand the language of honor or of nature. Deaf to their voice and dead to sensibility, he violently and repeatedly pushed the muzzle of his gun against Putnam's ribs, and finally gave him a cruel blow on the jaw with the butt of his piece. After this dastardly deed he left him. At length the active intrepidity of Dell and Harmon, seconded by the persevering valor of their followers, prevailed. They drove from the field the enemy, who left about 90 dead behind them. As they were retiring, Putnam was untied by the Indian who had made him prisoner, and whom he afterwards called master. Having been conducted for some distance from the place of action, he was stripped of his coat, vest, stockings, and shoes, loaded with as many packs of the wounded as could be piled upon him, strongly pinioned, and his wrists tied together as closely as they could be pulled with a cord. After he had marched through no pleasant paths in this painful manner for many a tedious mile, the party, who were excessively fatigued, halted to breathe. His hands were now immoderately swollen from the tightness of the ligature, and the pain had become intolerable. His feet were so much scratched that the blood dropped fast from them. Exhausted with bearing a burden above his strength, and frantic with torments exquisite beyond endurance, he entreated the Irish interpreter to implore as the last and only grace he desired of the Indians that they would knock him on the head and take his scalp at once, or loose his hands. A French officer, instantly interposing, ordered his hands to be unbound, and some of the packs to be taken off. By this time the Indian who captured him and who had been absent with the wounded, coming up, gave him a pair of moccasins, and expressed great indignation at the unworthy treatment his prisoner had suffered. That Indian chief again returned to the care of the wounded, and the Indians, about 200 in number, went before the rest of the party to the place where the whole were that night to encamp. They took with them Major Putnam, on whom, besides innumerable other outrages, they had the barbarity to inflict a deep wound with a tomahawk in the left cheek. His sufferings were in this place to be consummated. A scene of horror, infinitely greater than had ever met his eyes before, was now preparing. It was determined to roast him alive. For this purpose they led him into a dark forest, stripped him naked, bound him to a tree, and piled dry brush with other fuel at a small distance in a circle around him. They accompanied their labors as if for his funeral dirge, with screams and sounds inimitable but by savage voices. Then they set the piles on fire. A sudden shower damped the rising flame. Still they strove to kindle it until at last the blaze ran scarcely round the circle. Major Putnam soon began to feel the scorching heat. His hands were so tied that he could move his body. He often shifted sides as the fire approached. This sight, at the very idea of which all but savages must shudder, afforded the highest diversion to his inhuman tormentors, who demonstrated the delirium of their joy by corresponding yells, dances, and gesticulations. He saw clearly that his final hour was inevitably come. He summoned all his resolution, and composed his mind, as far as the circumstances would admit, to bid an eternal farewell to all he held most dear. To quit the world would scarcely have cost a single pang, but for the idea of home, the remembrance of domestic endearments of the affectionate partner of his bosom, and of their beloved offspring. His mind was ultimately fixed on a happier state of existence, beyond the tortures he was beginning to endure. The bitterness of death, even of that death which is accompanied with the keenest agonies, was in a manner past. Nature, with a feeble struggle, was quitting its last hold on sublunary things, when a French officer rushed through the crowd, opened a way by scattering the burning brands, and unbound the victim. It was Molang himself, to whom an Indian, unwilling to see another human sacrifice immolated, had run and communicated the tidings. That commandant spurned and severely reprimanded the barbarians, whose nocturnal powwows and hellish orgies he suddenly ended. Putnam did not want for feeling and gratitude. The French commander, fearing to trust him alone with them, remained until he could deliver him in safety into the hands of his master. The Indian approached his prisoner kindly, and seemed to treat him with particular affection. He offered him some hard biscuits, but finding that he could not chew them on account of the blow he had received from the Frenchman, this more humane Indian soaked some of the biscuit in water, and made him suck the pulp-like part. Determined, however, not to lose his captive, the refreshment being finished, he took the moccasins from his feet, and tied them to one of his wrists. Then, directing him to lie down on his back upon the bare ground, he stretched one arm to its full length, and bound it fast to a young tree. The other arm was extended and bound in the same manner. His legs were stretched apart and fastened to two saplings. Then a number of tall but slender poles were cut down, which with some long bushes were laid across his body from head to foot. On each side lay as many Indians as could conveniently find lodging, in order to prevent the possibility of escape. In this disagreeable and painful posture he remained until morning. During this night, the longest and most dreary conceivable, our hero used to relate that he felt a ray of cheerfulness come casually across his mind, and could not even refrain from smiling, when he reflected on this ludicrous group for a painter, of which he himself was the principal figure. The next day he was allowed his blankets and moccasins, and permitted to march without carrying any pack, or receiving any insults. To allay his extreme hunger, a little bear's meat was given, which he sucked through his teeth. At night the party arrived at Ticonderoga, and the prisoner was placed under the care of a French guard. The Indians, who had been prevented glutting their diabolical thirst for blood, took other opportunity of manifesting their malevolence for the disappointment, by horrid grimaces and angry gestures, but they were suffered no more to offer violence or personal indignity to him. After having been examined by the Marquis de Montcalm, Major Putnam was conducted to Montreal by a French officer, who treated him with the greatest indulgence and humanity. So that is the story of Major Putnam's captivity, where he was nearly burned to death by Indians in upstate New York in 1758. He was saved from execution first by rain, which briefly put out the fire, and then by a French officer, Molang, who intervened and prohibited the Indians from burning Major Putnam to death. One of the Indians had sent for Molang, apparently in disgust at the torture and execution. Major Putnam would also serve in the Revolutionary War on the American side, while Rogers, whose conduct during this battle was questionable, would fight for the British side. Rogers may have partially caused this engagement, because he and another soldier were firing at a mark, which helped Molang and the Indians locate them. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Major Putnam was from the Putnam family of Salem, Massachusetts. Two of his great uncles, Thomas and Deacon Edward Putnam, along with Thomas's daughter Anne, were some of the principal accusers involved in the witch trials. Thomas and his daughter Anne combined made over 100 accusations of witchcraft. However, the grandfather of Major Israel Putnam from this story, Joseph Putnam, along with his wife Elizabeth Porter, were opposed to the witch trials. There have also been several other notable Americans who descended from this same Putnam family of Massachusetts. This channel was begun because the story of people like Major Putnam and others who risked their lives during the French and Indian War and later the United States Revolution are now viewed as unworthy of airtime on history channels on TV, and unworthy of interest by our modern so-called historians. So here on this channel, our mission is to preserve this true history of our ancestors by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support the mission of our channel, then please become a Patreon or YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.